this experience of organizing for COLA has done to kind of maybe shift some of your perspectives, and also how it's working the community in light of recent events. So just a few things about this conversation. I've had the fortune to be part of this conversation in community with a group called Scholars for Social Justice. And a lot of that activism is organized out of Chicago with people like, hi, Kevin, how are you? One of my PhD students is here. It's so good to see you. That effort, Scholars for Social Justice, emerged after the 2016 election. And what originally was going to be a group of scholars to think about the issues of reparations for slavery and universities has emerged as a group that thinks about critical university studies in different ways, and has organized around this issue of universities, slavery, and reparations as a framework to help other folks think about the relationship between institutions and communities. And so the thing that has been really interesting to me as someone who worked on Georgetown's working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation in 2015 is the ways that conversation about university history and slavery has been able to evolve into a conversation about universities and accountability today. And I think it was Boston Review a few weeks ago had that piece about universities and land grabs. And it's been really interesting for schools that were founded after the abolition of slavery, the ways they are thinking about land theft and exploitation outside of the confines of slavery in the U.S. to ask some of these questions. The very best book, no one has time right now, but let's say you are not grading or teaching right now because it's ridiculous under these circumstances and you decide to read some books. I highly recommend Craig Wilder's Ebony and Ivy, because his book about slavery and the establishment of American universities is really important, because he makes this point that I think people often lose sight of. So when we think about universities in the context of slavery in the United States, we often think about a narrative about people who built the physical space, which is an important acknowledgement. And then sometimes people are willing to take a step back and thinking about the wealth that was generated through the system of slavery and brought to universities across the country. And so it helps break out this kind of north-south divide with which schools are implicated and which are not. But I think there is also a part of it that is deeper than the question of just laboring individuals and about ideology. And one of the arguments he makes is that universities were the place where ideologies about white supremacy were taught, reproduced, and then given to people who then became physicians who created medical knowledge, and to ministers of various faiths who then supported the system of slavery in their theological formations. And then it was used for people who then governed in colonies and governed in the United States. And so there's an ideological way that slavery in the university reproduces itself that I think for us today we are contending with when we think about how universities imagine who belongs and who doesn't belong, and the way that then the questions of labor and the questions of community emerge. And so as someone who was working in the context of a Catholic university that was trying to frame this issue of slavery in the university as kind of like people are bringing up a hidden history, to someone who was saying, okay, if we believe that this history was hidden, which it really wasn't, but let's say that this history it's hidden, what does this exposure say about time? Because I think that if you're watching like CBS News or some type of news package, the story is supposed to be one of triumph, that slavery no longer animates the university, and therefore we are free. But if you take a critical university studies look, it's like slavery builds the university, and forms of either forced or unequal labor then animate its possibilities in the future. And so this is where I think the UC students' struggle becomes really important, because it helps us really navigate that difficult space that I think a lot of people have a hard time wrapping around their heads around, as the university is not a benevolent actor, right? It's always good that kids learn stuff. It's always good to be in the community, that universities are institutional forces that gain its institutional understanding and knowledge out of systems of inequality. And so when you frame it that way, saying, well, we need a living wage should be consistent, right, with the pursuit of knowledge and truth versus, you're countering what we need to do as an institution. Gosh, COVID is wild, no? Because it has upended, it's so weird. Like, of all the things to live through, right? But what it has done, it has taken the teetering institution that is higher education, and it not only does the thing where it exposes the inequality among its actors, but it's creating this kind of new delivery model that calls into question then how is a value made visible to the public? And so one way of saying it is like, okay, universities are places where you can develop vaccines or therapies or treatments. There can be medical research. Or you could say universities are just places for privileged young people to like spin their wheels. These are two kind of ways that people are looking at this crisis. Or universities are places where quality teachers are able to use technology to adjust to a new set of circumstances. Or you could say, well, who exactly is teaching at universities? Because when my college student in my household is on Zoom, they're not being taught by a professor. They're being taught by graduate students who are not being compensated for their labor. So I think that this moment is a moment of both exposure and disruption, because the questions that we'll be asking moving forward is, why is it that some universities will not survive COVID? And what does it mean for the universities that have the capacity to? How was their wealth generated historically, and how is their wealth sustained today? The question of who returns to school and under what circumstances. This idea that there are a group of students who will say, well, I'll just take a gap year. I'll take a year off and then I'll return. What does that then mean for who is going to be on a college campus and who's not? For all of the families where the person who may have been in college will now have to earn wages. What does this mean then for the university as this place of deep social inequality? And I think about, as this thing was unfolding, a student was talking about, as a student with a disability, whether she should risk staying on campus or going back home. Well, then what does it mean then if the college dorm becomes this site, right, of health crisis? Then what does it mean for our ability to accommodate students with disabilities? So this is like blowing open all of this stuff. And I think that for the purposes of your organizing, that this may be the moment where the wider public, not just the people who are doing inside baseball higher education, to understand kind of what's at stake. Because for the first time, for some people, they're realizing that grocery store workers are very important workers, and there's understanding what does it mean when we have a healthcare system that like you may or may not be able to get treated. Like all of this stuff was happening before, but I think that there's a way in which these questions about work and labor and pay and precarity are brought into a space where people are saying, oh, this is what happens when when workers don't have the basic needs they need to live their lives. So I think that this is a moment that is so terribly devastating and can be so clarifying for folks like yourselves who are thinking about these very issues and how it intersects with the university. The last two things I want to say, and then I really want to hear from all of you, is some of the regional specificity of this work of the university and its past has been really fascinating to think about. People like Devarian Baldwin, who has a new book coming out in a little bit called Universities, where he talks about it in terms of gentrification. And he looks at the University of Chicago, which earned some of its early wealth through slaveholding, and then its presence on the south side of Chicago. And we can trace this all the way to the present, where the University of Chicago was like building a new hospital and they didn't want to bring a trauma center in, right? Because in a city like Chicago, trauma center means gunshot wounds means a certain type of population. So how does that work together? The other thing that I think is important to also think about it is we think about places like the urban center because we think about universities and university hospitals and gentrification, but I also want us to think about communities where even if there isn't the kind of population density, the ability for universities to use land for its own purposes is still a critical kind of moral question. I started out my career at the University of Oklahoma, and then and I'd gone to what they call land grant institution at the University of Missouri, and so there's an idea that land is plentiful, right? There's enough land, right? We know where that idea comes from, so you can build wherever. But this question is of what are you building on these sites? Nuclear power plants, reactors, hospitals that can draw a lot of revenue for elective surgery, but are they serving community needs? What kind of testing is happening in these high-tech labs? And so I think that regardless, and I think the UC system is actually an excellent place to think about these politics, about how you're connected by this relationship to the state, but the needs at Berkeley and the needs at Santa Cruz, the resources at UCLA versus Merced also kind of expose these the inequality even within this graduate student organizing community, right? Which programs are the ones that are leveraged for teaching and which programs are the ones where the graduate students are protected? I'm really moved by your work. When I went to graduate school 20 years ago, maybe like a little under 20 years ago, I started graduate school, and we were the first cohort that had health insurance. And that was like a big deal, which is wild to me. I'm also of the age where the Affordable Care Act passed when I was a professional. So my entire adult life was knowing people who had to do part-time work to get insurance. You couldn't stay on your parents till you're 26, and how that fundamentally changed how people looked at the future, right? Like, oh, I could get a job and not work a second job for health insurance, or like maybe I have insurance until I'm in my mid-20s, but we know the reality for a lot of the graduate student community is that most of you are over 26, right? So I've seen this kind of change in how people imagine what's possible for the future, and it's not because like of great technologies like Zoom, and it's not because we have iPhones, it's because people have some idea that they maybe could get sick and it didn't completely destroy their lives, and we're still not on the other side of that. And so that's what's so amazing about seeing what graduate student struggle is like today and remembering that shift and seeing how insufficient that shift was in really securing your present moment so that you can do things in the future. So I just wanted to say that. Did I have anything else? Hot takes. I go on and on about this stuff all the time, but I'm better with Q&A. So if folks have questions, you can either take it to the chat or, I don't know, maybe people shouldn't unmute themselves. I'm so anxious about all this Zoom bombing. I love how racist and terrible people always innovate. What the fuck? This thing was just we just started doing this and now you found a way to be terrible. Congratulations, you're the worst. All right, let's take it in the chat function. Or I can keep talking. Okay, let me say something about reparations and then I really will stop. So since this work that's happened with Georgetown and slavery has become kind of a national issue, there's something I want to say about reparations, because I think it's both an issue that since the 19th century has animated a lot of the ways people think about racial justice, just no one's done it. But I think in terms of claims that can be made on the university, I'm always very I always get very nervous about the ways we frame it. And so I actually went to Brown in the 2000s when then President Ruth Simmons did this huge exploration of Brown's history with slaveholding. And what was really fascinating was that this is before Twitter and really before the internet was fun, but Fox News got a hold of this story, and they were like, Georgetown's Reparations Committee are going to give away money. And it was this big kerfuffle, and it was this idea that admitting that a university was entrenched in the institution of slavery was the worst thing you could do. And what was interesting is the other Ivy League schools were like, oh, really? That's interesting, not us. And no one talked about it. But when it reemerged in the context of Georgetown, which is being led by a white male versus Ruth Simmons as a black woman, there was this idea that this was given some kind of like moral credit, like, oh, this is so amazing. And what was also interesting about that story is because of the archival work and the historical work that Georgetown's doing about slavery and the university, what has emerged is a visible community of people who broadly define themselves as descendants of this history, right? And what's really fascinating, the framing of the descendant community and what they're owed, the default position is always like scholarships, which no one is entitled to necessarily in this community, but this idea that, oh, the university is giving scholarships to people because they are descendants of the people that the university held. And I just think that this is the most bizarre kind of framing, because when you frame reparations or any type of restorative justice practice with the university in terms of access to it or how to pay for it, you lose sight of the different crimes of the university, which for the university side, excellent like chess move, but for the kind of critical reasoning side, it loses sight of the impact of a university on a community, on slaveholding, on Native American displacement and violence. Like, it loses sight of all of that, and it turns everything into the great tragedy of that moment was you didn't get to go to this college. What? It's like so infuriating. And like 99% of the time I talk about this stuff, people will frame it that way. And I say, well, what about direct cash payments to descendants? And this is what the student movement at Georgetown was all about. This idea of leveraging student funds for the purpose of reparations. And everyone was like beside themselves. And what was interesting for the purposes of what you are all doing is that the students just did a really good campaign. They made it a referendum issue on campus. And what they did, which everyone should do when they're running a progressive campaign, is you don't try to change anyone's mind, you just bring new voters to the table. So the students had this very sophisticated idea that like, we give this money for this larger framework of reparations because this is our education and this was a great historical sacrifice. We put it in a fund in which people could access direct cash payments for whatever they want. It doesn't have to go back to the university, but we take ownership of this history. And the way we win this is we just get more voters to the table. So they won the referendum and the university inserted itself and say, oh, well, we'll take over this process. We will not implement the student fund. We will create a charity, right? A philanthropic act. We'll take the money you would have raised and we will distribute it that way. I was like, gosh, the Jedi tricks are like amazing to me, right? Because what the students were doing is saying that we have these mechanisms to use our tuition dollars in these various ways, whether it's for speakers or parties or, when I was in college, Disney, do you know they design college gyms? I don't know if they do this anymore, but I mean, like, it was like flat screen TVs and like a fake grotto. It was very like Playboy Mansion. The 90s were a bad time for college campus planning, but nonetheless, right? So you could use student funds if there was a vote for this type of shenanigans, right? And so the students say, well, we're going to use it to think about us in terms of a reparations framework. And that is such a direct challenge to the authority of the university as the holder of this history, the sharer of the history, and then the person who decides to mediate the wrongs, right? So they took that away from the students. Students were really pissed, and they were kind of reorganizing, rethinking about their strategy. But I say all of this as to say that the reparation strategy isn't just about how we're going to resolve an issue. It also indicates how we see an issue. So if I came into your home and stole a sandwich, and then I enjoyed the sandwich, it was delicious, and you're like, hey, you took my sandwich, and I'm like, oh, sorry, and I gave you a can of pop. For all you Midwesterners, it's soda. For everyone else in the other parts of the country, you would be like, well, you gave me something, but you didn't give me back a sandwich, so what am I supposed to do with this, right? And so this idea that slavery and its remnants are the poverty, the mass incarceration, the underemployment, the literacy gap, all of these things, and to say, well, you can like if you jump the hurdles to get into an elite university, we'll help you pay for it. It is like a mind-blowing idea, but it shows the ways that when we think about these strategies of repair, it also is about the implications of trust in the community that has the capacity and power to repair itself. So for all of you who are in this COLA struggle, I'm sure someone's going to be like, okay, we're not going to give you a cost of living, but what if we have a competitive fund that you're going to have to stay up all night and do some ridiculous application, and maybe if you're the winner, you get $500. And you're like, wait, what? And then they're like, this is awesome. We've never done this before for graduate students. And you're like, well, I kind of need $500, but you're like, wait a second, what was I asking for? And it's like, oh, wait a second, I was asking for a quality of life in a wildly expensive part of the country so that I can learn my craft, and I'm also a full-time worker, and someone gave me the opportunity to compete with my other workers for $500. It's just like they get in your head, and then you're like, oh wait, maybe this makes sense. It never makes sense. Whatever they are offering to you at any moment that is short of the things you've demanded make no sense. And then you're like, wait a second, maybe up is down. Maybe the sky is orange, and it's like not. But it's framed in a way for you to misunderstand or like not know what you're talking. It's amazing. As someone who has been in this profession for over a decade, I see versions of it all the time, and I'm like, I am never fully prepared for the level of kind of exchange that happens. And it's how movements get co-opted. It's how people get confused. It's how people start fighting. So I'm just really glad about what the work that all of you are doing. I'm glad that this can be part of our institutional history of movements, right? That graduate education should not and cannot be just a leisure class activity. And what you're doing isn't just about the fact that you live in expensive places and you need to be compensated fairly, but what you're creating is a structure to actually change the dynamics of the academy. Because for all of the the graduate students again with their demands to be paid fairly, there's another narrative about the pipeline problem. Why are the first-gen students not going to graduate school? How come only people from the most kind of elite and pedigreed backgrounds can become professors? The lack of diversity questions, as if these are two separate parts, right, of how you transform these institutions. And so every time there's a meeting about equity or diversity, you say, well, COLA is an equity and diversity issue. And every time there's how come there's only 3 women in this lab? I guess there's sexism in this field. I guess it's terrible. It's like, well, actually, you could have gender diversity if you actually took seriously paying people, right? And so I think that there was an interest in making all of this seem so disparate, and that this came out of nowhere. But this is what universities do. There are a lot of very bright people who work at universities, but there aren't tons of people who are really concerned about justice and the costs of this. And I think with COVID, seriously, last comment, and then I want questions. But I think with COVID, this will give such incredible cover to every kind of cut, every kind of the disaster capitalism of our industry is going to really reveal itself. And I think that what we're going to see is universities have had these really draconian ideas on ice. And they're like, this is our moment. And I think that has to be part of the education, saying they said that COVID caused this problem, but actually this problem existed before. Or yes, COVID is going to exacerbate all sorts of things. And I take that very seriously, and I have a lot of compassion for the people who have to deal with these issues. But we're not going to be able to survive the next pandemic if we negotiate on the backs of campus workers and it's not going to work that way. And so it's also really hard to do this when we feel so disconnected because we're all meeting remotely. But I think that you should also take a lot of heart in the fact that you had set the table for this moment such a long time ago. And now we're seeing the different ways that, it can be presented to a larger public. Well, one of the, it's interesting, the kind of like the trends of higher education, they come really rapidly. It's for higher education doesn't change, but then the trends come at like rapid fire pace. And so, do you remember when it was, what did MOOC stand for? Or like or EduX. It's all these ideas. Like basically the concept was like I was going to teach a class from my guest room like I am right now, and 90 billion people would sign up for it, and then I would like tell them to buy my book, and then I would get this revenue, and then this like tech company would get revenues. This is before like our pre-Zoom era was the dream. This was the dream that I would do this and like millions of people would hear me and I would make all this money. And then that kind of failed. And then it was all of these other experimental stuff. What has become incredibly interesting in the past few years is that the term first generation college student has become a seemingly apolitical way of talking about racial and ethnic diversity without talking about the dynamics of racial and ethnic diversity. So more institutions will talk about how they really care, especially the UC system, first generation college students, because that's supposed to be a marker of race and ethnicity and class, even though it's not always a marker of those things. So what you're going to see now is that universities saying that they don't take into account finances for admissions, and their first generation students are very important, but at the same time seeing students as workers is still something that's very difficult for people to like appreciate and respect. And so what we've seen in this era of moving online is students still reporting like, I'm a student and a worker on campus, but when I'm home, I need to be more of a worker than a student to help sustain my family. Or, yes, I'm a student worker on campus, but in a global crisis that we're in, I have to be more of a worker. Can you accommodate me as a student? And then depending on the institution, it's like, well, no, your primary job is to be a student. You were so available when you were on campus. What has changed? And so it's this idea that there are a lot of financial support from places like the Bloomberg Charities to do more first generation college student stuff and college advising, and all of this idea about low-income students undermatching, going to schools where they go to because it's familiar, but they could go to more prestigious schools, all of the things that are tied up into this. Well, moving remote has made this interesting thing because I think it has exposed at some campuses just how much students have to be workers all the time, and that we are now bumping up against the time where the work becomes that much more important. And so I think that this will be a really interesting moment as the anecdotes start dripping out of how people are handling this conversion, of understanding some of these. Yes, it was a massively open online courseware. That was the MOOC experiment. But what does it mean for students to have these economic challenges in a different context, in a different economic context? People think, okay, because you're home, you should be able to do the same things, instead of you are home in the middle of a global economic financial crisis, right? It's like it doesn't work like that anymore. But it requires universities to see the economic complexity of their students. And the reality is that so much of our conversation and about higher education is about the most elite schools. It's about the UCs and the Michigans and the Texas and the North Carolinas, but the critical mass of schools cannot survive any of this. I mean, that's the reality, and neither can their students bear this burden, because most of their students are not childless people between 18 and 22. They're like working adults that have dependents. And so, I don't know how a lot of schools survive this. I just don't. Any other questions? Did anyone do the reading? I'm just kidding. What else am I going to say? So, are they still negotiating with all of you, or are they just being like, oh, because of COVID, we can't talk to anyone about wages? So let me ask you this. Has there been a work stoppage since you've gone online? So I think the thing that's so interesting about this is about institutional precarity and the thin margins that universities are operating under. And I think this is also a really helpful time to think about the revenue generation of the very few schools that are able to do it with athletics that have been disrupted, but campus auxiliary services also, like if you don't have people constantly buying and consuming on a campus, the loss, and then the use of residence halls for summer camps, and it's like all of these things are so important for the revenue streams of the institution. And to ask the questions, okay, if this is your revenue stream, for what purposes and in what ways, right? So if you have to rely on an enrichment camp to fill the dorms to make money, what does it mean to have these camps? And what does it mean to kind of sell academic rigor to wealthier, young people at the expense of young people who have to work during their stuff? Like, it's all of these kind of complex ways that every time a university says, like, we've lost $90 billion because we're not selling hot dogs at a baseball game, saying like, well, what does that mean then for then the amateur players who don't see anything from hot dog sales? Like, I think that again, universities are now having to, because they are strapped, tell us how much they're making from these different venues. And I think this information is so helpful. The other day I got an email, something like $4 million is going to be lost because they can't open for summer camps. And I think that's like a really powerful number. Like $4 million is a lot of money, but I have a lot of questions about the development of this kind of extracurricular arm to like balance a budget. And I think someone told me that like my institution has already lost $25 million, and that was like a week ago. And then someone else who's a college president at a small private college says that every week the students are not there, they lose $1 million. The Chronicle did this like survey of some college presidents, and they asked them, how many of you like are gonna do tuition refunds? And like a quarter was like maybe. And then how many of you had to do housing refunds? A lot of housing refunds came. And then it was like, well, how many of you are going to dip into your endowments? And like 15% are like, maybe we'll dip into it, right? And I think that, again, this question of endowments, there was that weirdo who was like, endowments shouldn't be dipped into to pay for campus workers. Like, people are exposing all of these dynamics on any other day, right? They would never kind of engage in their like real money. But if they're using this as a basis on why things can't happen, I think this is a great opportunity to say, well, how did this structure emerge as revenue generation? And why is this the way that you are able to either sell your brand or sell your property? Like, how is this the thing? And is this the healthiest way for us to engage, not just as a campus community, but with the larger community? Each of your campuses is situated in a different part of California, but none of you go to schools or being educated in schools where like people in the local communities love you to death, right? We're just like can't get more excited by when you have a new building or when you put everyone in contract labor and not in like strong union jobs. So like there's all of these different ways again, and I think it's great that you talked about mutual aid and like seeing this as an opportunity to build community off the campus, because everyone is now talking in numbers that can help people really understand how these dynamics and how all of this money allows them to have all of this power. Anyone else? I'll take a couple more questions before like dinner time. Mm-hmm. No, go ahead, Naomi. Mm-hmm. I think this one's so hard for student groups, especially if they're kind of oriented for advocating for workers or trying to do this type of movement work, because on one hand, they have multiple relationships on the campus. And I wrote a piece a few weeks back in the Chronicle about Black student protest, and that it seems like in 50 years of Black student protests, what we've learned is that universities call it, leadership training, and they co-opt all the work, and then they get annoyed if the students make more demands. And it's that type of benevolent behavior where, again, like, funding becomes the way that you indicate care. But what the funding's for, if the funding is sustainable, will it last more than 2 years? Are you waiting for us all to graduate to cut the funding? Doesn't become part of the calculation. And so I think that's why student groups have to think about things in terms of campaigns. What did the campaign ask for? Did this campaign win? How is this going to inspire our next campaign? And I think even the framing of campaign can feel more powerful than protest because of the ways that universities co-opt protest. Because there's nothing more bizarre than going onto a campus and they're commemorating like the first, like African-American graduate of a school. And I'm like, oh, you mean that person who was super traumatized and like got death threats and barely made it out? And now there's an award named after them? Like, I don't know about this one, right? But this idea that student groups are engaged in campaigns and you win some parts of it and you lose some parts of it but you claim it as a campaign so that the university cannot so easily frame itself as responding to protest, because I think universities understand that dynamic. Like, because of the student protest, we moved the university forward, or as a university, we denied the demands of these campaigns, and now we find ourselves with more campaigns. It may seem like a slight semantic difference, but because universities love taking protest and making it seem as if it's at the heart of the institution, I think I just, like, every time that starts, I'm like, oh, can we stop? And so I think also part of the problem is that I think students are well-intentioned and they have a lot of passion, but when they become the consultants to the institution, this is when I start to get very uncomfortable. So there's like this point where students are pissed, they organize a really good campaign, they protest, and then there's a point where the university invites them for a seat at the table. And this is where things get really, really, like nerve-wracking, because students are now experiencing a kind of power that they had been shut out of. It's being used as a way to then kind of maybe even like reward the student in some strange ways, and then it guts kind of the critique that was at the heart of it. And university is really good at it. And one of the things I really like about what I see in this generation of organizers that I see on campus and other places, they determine their point of, like the extinction point for their engagement. So if you're organizing a protest or a campaign around COLA, and you've sat down and you've made demands, someone will invite you to the seat on the table to figure out how they do it. That is not your role. You have brought a set of conditions before the university. They have made some agreements. They have entire mechanisms to make sure that it works and it is sustainable. But what I see, especially with undergraduates, that undergraduate is now doing the economic modeling for the institution to see how they can do this. That is inappropriate, because what that will ultimately happen is this weird power dynamic. And once the university is through with that student perspective, they push them out, or they co-opt the student as an example of their benevolence or their ability to be progressive. So when I talk to students, I'm like, always decide when the stop point is. When you no longer engage, you no longer go to meetings. I mean, I really do think the university strategy is slow death by meeting. It's like you go to so many meetings until you just stop caring, and then they fill you with box lunches, and so your sodium levels are bananas, and you just can't do anything anymore. But I see it happen all the time, and I think the students who really kind of get that always say, okay, once they've made this commitment, we step out of the way, and then we hold them accountable to implement that. We don't become the facilitators of the strategy or the plan, and we don't draft the solution. All right. One more question. Okay. Go ahead. Just start with the questions, and we'll see where it takes us. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Ooh, those are good. Those are excellent questions. So I think, the kind of the question about kind of possibility, hope, and what is worth it, and does contesting the institution then remind you of its power? Like, what's the point? I think that that's for every individual to discern for themselves. I understand when people are at either a point of exhaustion or pessimism that they choose not to engage. Like, I'm not one of these, like, if you don't like it, you've got to vote. It's like, well, voting's corrupt and it's a bankrupt system. And I understand when people say, okay, voting is the only access I have to power, I'm going to do this. That's fine. I think the challenge of that construction is all or nothing. It's either all struggle or no struggle. It's either all wins or no wins. Like, we have to have some place in the middle as individuals to say, okay, we're stepping into struggle, we're going to retreat from struggle, we're stepping back into struggle. So I actually think that, like, there are ways to have a healthy life in which you're in struggle and then you remove yourself because your community is large enough where you don't have to be constantly in that space. The democratizing question, I think, is such a good one because we're seeing what democracy gets us, folks. So I think that the idea of, like, one person, one vote, the idea of, like, every voice has a place. I love the idea of it, and I love the idea of that we can think of our campaigns as a place of participatory democracy, but we see where the challenges lie. I think the question is about vision and routes to ensuring that vision is maybe what I think is helpful in framing the university question. Because I don't know if I'm necessarily anti-institution, because I think there can be some institutional context that plays with ideas of power, that institutions don't always have to use their power for, like, disgusting reasons. Like, I think that is possible. I think we have yet to see it. And so when people talk about abolishing the university, I think what I take from that is abolishing the practices that allow the university to have power that is excessive and painful, but I will never argue against the possibility that we come in community to learn together. Like, I think that is all we have. It can happen inside and outside of a university, but to the extent that a university makes that possible, I think that's actually a generative space. And then your last question is how we do it in the classroom. The only thing I can say about the difference between student organizing and worker organizing is we have to concede where the stakes are united and where the stakes are different. That graduate students are workers, hospital techs are workers, cafeteria staff are workers. They are working within a context that degrades their labor. That degradation looks different in different ways in different days, and I think sometimes when students really take on the work of the other workers on campus, they have to do it in a way that is respectful and clear about the distinctions between their work and maybe their access to power and the fact that they're all, like, under the giant boulder of capitalism. Because sometimes it can just seem a little forced, or kind of like, when we see these coalitions, sometimes groundskeepers are like, oh, these damn students, like, what are they talking about? Or what you realize is that the vision of intellectual workers can sometimes be different than cafeteria workers. How do you both acknowledge that you're in part of a struggle without diminishing or demeaning someone else's vision of what a good deal looks like, right? And I think that this has been the classic kind of struggle of unions and the struggle of organizing across a lot of vectors. But I also think that, like, for you as educators, for those of you who are teaching students, anytime you have an opportunity to help them reframe the way they think about power, the better. It's just, like, whatever it is, it's like, I'm the teacher, I'm the boss, like, I have all the power, and then you sit there and you, like, struggle with my, like, excessive need for power. Like, most of us were taught in that way, and even some of us please don't share the names, but some of us have graduate advisors who really operate under that kind of model. And so sometimes, even when we have a deep desire to have a different vision of sharing power, we don't even know what it looks like because no one's ever afforded us that opportunity. And so for graduate workers who are teaching, I always say, like, some of the most powerful things that you can do is talk to each other about, like, how your experiences of being in the classroom has made you feel, like, small and demeaned, and really rethink about those strategies. So that's the best I got, folks. I don't know what's going to happen with this. Like, every time I'm like, okay, surely there's got to be a way on the other side of this. I am proven wrong, but this is what I do know. And I'm gonna leave you with my parting thought. I think Kevin has maybe heard this one before, as a teaching assistant in my class. I do not know what will happen, but I know we have each other, and that is worth a lot. And that's what I always tell my students, because I literally thought 2016 couldn't get any more ridiculous, and here we are. But we're here. And more than anything else, I think what has been really exciting is we're here with each other, in this space where we're just imagining something different than what's happening today. And most days, that's the thing that I can value the most, as all of this unfolds. But I am incredibly grateful to Serena for inviting me here. I did my doctoral fellowship at UCSB. Everything was like $9 million then, so I can only imagine what it's like now. So UCSB, like, my heart is with you. Just because you can see the mountain and the water doesn't mean life is good. Like, it's beautiful, but like, you have to pay people so they can take care of themselves. Like, what's the problem here? If there's any ways I can be of service to you and other UC students, let me know. For faculty like myself, if we ever get back to in real life activities or anything, we would love to see you. If I get invited to UC school and you think I shouldn't come, I'm happy to not come and then make a big deal out of it and be really dramatic in my refusal. Like, how dare you, UC, invite me anywhere? I'm good for that. Not very much else with that. But anyway, folks, good night, and take good care of yourself and each other, okay?